There are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And if you want to understand the future, look to the past. These are two famous quotes, the first by Vladimir Lenin and the second by Albert Einstein. And I think the combination of these two perfectly sums up the conversation I'm going to have today with a good friend of mine. His name is Michael Every. And through his framework that he labels economic statecraft, or in more flowery terms, grand macro strategy, he has more accurately called where the world is headed, starting 10 years ago to where it is now, than anybody else I have seen. And I came across his work almost 10 years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And when I started reading it, I felt like he had opened up my brain and was saying all the things that I wanted to say, but he said it in much more sophisticated language than I was able to use when I was talking to people about where I thought the world was headed. And so the relationship with Michael has been fantastic because we've been able to kind of discuss a number of things which in many ways and for a very long time were outside the Overton window or the acceptable topics for discussion. And while what we initially started talking about these several years ago was very kind of counter to what many expected, much of it is now seems to be playing out in real time. And while Michael and I, communicate by a text message and email and DMs quite frequently, I haven't had the chance to speak to him in person for a while. So what follows here is a recent conversation or that we're about to have. And I hope you find it I hope you're as excited to listen to it as I am excited to have it. And I hope you are able to appreciate the insights that Michael has. And if you already know him, I know that you're looking forward to hearing it. And if you haven't heard of Michael before, I think you are in for a treat. If I didn't say this already, he is a global strategist at Rabobank in Singapore. He has lived and worked all over the world for a number of years and has real world boots on the ground experience in many different countries and in many different cultures. And I think he is kind of uniquely qualified to speak on these subjects that we're going to speak about. And so, like I said, for me, I'm very excited, and I hope you guys find it as entertaining as I'm sure that I am going to. Okay, thanks for being here. Michael, it's great to see you.
Yeah, great to be back. How are you?
I'm good. It's funny. I feel like we message each other and, kind of DM and email all the time, but I don't think we've spoken for probably 6 months. And
yeah, it's been a good chunk of time. And yeah, as you said, it feels like we're on the same page on many things most of the time. But I guess that goes, so great minds think alike.
Well, the funny thing about it is I literally just in the intro, I said, I quoted the famous Lenin quote about the decades where nothing happens and then there's weeks where decades happen. And I think a few decades have happened in the last 6 months. So I've been looking forward to doing this. And, for everybody watching here, we don't have an agenda. We're just going to talk because we have so much to catch up on with what's going on in the world. And it's just really, really fascinating right now. But Michael, what I would, before we kind of just get into talking and rambling, what I would love for you to do is if you could just give a quick overview of your role at Rabobank and then give a quick, without going into too much detail, overview of what you consider to be, economic statecraft and your framework that you refer to as grand macro strategy.
Sure. Very quick version of both. So I'm a global strategist within economics and markets for Rabobank, based in Singapore, although I'm all over the place most of the time. And that role is cross-asset, cross-geography, and cross-disciplinary. So I don't manage money. I've done lots of different iterations of kind of macro and strategy roles over the past nearly 3 decades now. But what I try and do is capture the zeitgeist, the big picture, and point out uncomfortable truths if trends continue. So if I spot something going 2, 4, 8, 16, and I know the world blows up at 32, I'm waving my hand. raising my arm, basically trying to point that out as much as possible. That's pretty much what I do. And there have been periods where there's been a lot of wait and see and not a lot's happened. And this is a period where there's a lot of finding out going on rather than waiting and seeing. And it's a very, very fast moving dynamic time. But I think, to answer the second part of the question, the only way we can interpret what's happening at the moment is either chasing around like a headless chicken from headline to headline, going, wow, 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 which frankly is a lot of people in markets, or take a big picture view and understand what that is. And I've tried to wrap that up since Trump was reelected. In fact, the day he was reelected, I published on it, saying we would see a shift from economic policy, which we all understand. Anyone watching this knows what economic policy is by different area: fiscal, monetary, FX, trade, energy, yada, 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 to economic statecraft. And the key difference between policy and statecraft is with statecraft, you combine all of them together like fingers and a thumb into a fist. And it can be offensive or defensive, but you're doing it with a purpose. And you ask yourself this question: what is GDP for? That's my big shtick. What is GDP for? Once you start answering that question, how you do everything else and how they all line up is obvious to you, because you have to do X, Y, Z, regardless of what the rules say or markets say. But until you ask yourself that question, you don't join anything up, and nothing that you're doing has any strategic sense. So we're now in a world of economic statecraft. And in fact, we're moving rapidly along the spectrum of economic statecraft from defensive to offensive, and into whole new isms, like you're hearing neo-imperialism being thrown around at the moment for good reason. So it's absolutely at the cutting edge of economic statecraft where we are now.
Well, and so it's interesting because you come at this as from an analytical background or an event, but as you said at the beginning, you don't yourself manage money, and I come at it from the same, sort of analytical framework, but I do manage money, and I think you agree, but correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe 10 or 15 years ago, those two different areas didn't necessarily have to intersect. They might from time to time, but I think we both think that we are now in a time period where you cannot separate the two. In other words, it was a luxury we had maybe 10 or 15 years ago that we just no longer have. And you said that you laid this out on when Trump was reelected, but the truth is, if you go back and look at your writings for the last 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, you've been talking about this stuff for almost a decade now. And what's interesting is that for a while we would talk about it and then wait to see, but now we're actually seeing it. And in the last kind of 12 to 18 months, it's been picking up speed. And in the last 12 or 18 days, it's picking up speed even more. So maybe, before we get too much further into this as well, you could just talk about what that's been like, to talk about the maybe and the possibility to now not only the probability, but the reality.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very exciting time for all of us. Nerve-wracking, stressful. I'm not going to lie, it's kind of rewarding, even if it's also disturbing to see things that you were flagging as tail risks unfold. You're very kind, thank you, to refer to the fact that since basically 2014, 2015, I started writing on this theme. 2016, absolutely nailing it down and saying, look, the liberal world order can collapse. They have collapsed twice in the past. The path we're on now will lead to a repeat of that collapse, because we have a global paradigm whereby the only thing propping everything up, if you look behind the back of the stage, is American military power. And the economic and financial system that America is doing is best to prop up undermines its military power, because it doesn't have the factories to build the military goods to maintain that kind of power on a sustained basis. Other people are going to see that, are going to rearm. Power abhors a vacuum, and you're going to end up with a US-China clash, with others siding with China and some being forced to side with the US, and it is increasingly being forced to side with it. And the world will split, the liberal world order will collapse, and everything that you think you understand about how markets work will come tumbling down. So that's been the big picture view. But where it kind of specifically, the rubber meets the road, so to say, is I remember talking to a mutual friend of ours, Adam Taggart, great guy, again, just after Trump was reelected. And we were having a similar conversation. And he said, so look, for the average investor in the US or investor in US assets, what does that really mean? So Trump's been reelected. You're talking economic statecraft. Should you be bullish on the defense sector, for example, because Trump's going to re-arm? And I said to him, well, yes and no. I said, because from an economic policy perspective, you're going to throw money at defense. Ergo, that sector does well. From an economic statecraft perspective, you ask yourself, am I getting value for money? Are shareholders really minting it in a company that's charging $100 for a $1 widget because they're a monopoly in the defense sector? And from a financial perspective, that's where you go. From a statecraft perspective, you knock on the door of the defense firm and you say, I want that down to $1.50 ASAP. I don't care what it does to your P&L because I need those widgets. You don't win a war with profits. You win a war with bullets. And so that's already unfolded in the past couple of days where we've seen Trump specifically leaning on non-defense firms at the same time as he talks about increasing the defense budget by $500 billion. So you have to understand how to navigate it. And again, it comes back to that shtick. What is GDP for?
Okay, so along these lines, you said something a minute ago about the collapse of the liberal world order. And I think, I keep saying I think because I don't want to speak for you, but based on what I've read and the conversations I've had with a lot of other people, is that the collapse of the liberal world order, that is not such a surprise necessarily. Some people have seen that as a potential outcome for a long time. But what I think oftentimes with the people I end up speaking with or interacting with is that they equate the collapse of the liberal world order with the collapse of the United States. And that this is an event that will usher in the fall of the United States as the global hegemon and the global power. And what will come next is the rise of China or the rise of the global South or the BRICS or whichever other group you want to define. And where I have come down on it is, yes, the liberal world order or the rules-based order is going to come down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the United States falls on a relative basis versus the other countries. Could you speak to that and how you see that playing out?
Sure. And, long story short, we are of one mind on that because the US is the one who built the liberal world order. As I said, America imposed it, collaborated to build it with others. Although remember, for a long time, it was only around a third of the world that was in it. 1/3 was communist and the other third was what we used to call non-aligned. So we only got the whole world lined up behind it ostensibly from, around 2001 onwards. It's a relatively new development in historical terms, even if for someone who's young using Bloomberg, that seems like all of their life. But once you take that away, America is free to, lose influence in some respects. Absolutely. You take the gloves off, people see you for who you really are. You're not loved, perhaps, in the way that you were. But Machiavelli said, is it better to be loved or feared? And it's better to be feared if you have to choose between the two.
If you have to choose.
And I mean, if we look at what America has done, just a couple of months ago, and particularly, say, 18 months ago when Biden was still in office, you had this situation where the US was just, it was acting decisively in the Middle East, controversially but decisively, but it was floundering on many other fronts. And, it didn't really appear able to make any breakthrough against the array of countries and forces, non-state actors, that were really stacking the deck against it and encircling it to a degree and its allies. Well, hasn't that changed in the past couple of days or the past couple of weeks? Yes, you can look at Ukraine and say maybe that's changing in a way that doesn't favor Ukraine or it doesn't favor Europe or the West, etc. That's a whole separate debate. Let's just put that one on ice for now. But in Venezuela, well, that's, the Don Roe doctrine, in effect. That's America basically staking claim to Latin America and all the Western Hemisphere again. In fact, Trump overnight As we're recording this, it just said that the USMCA is irrelevant. So, all manner of things are going to flow from that Monroe Doctrine that we can unpack. And even in the Middle East, where Iran potentially, that regime could fall. I mean, we rewind to the middle of
It's crazy.
or even September. So yeah, it's crazy. But September 2023, you've got Iran encircling Israel with a whole host of powers. You've got Russia at war with Ukraine. You've got China in Asia. You've got Venezuela in Latin America, of course, with a Hezbollah and Iranian presence and a Russian presence and a Chinese presence in Venezuela, which everyone in the intelligence community knew about. Suddenly, Latin America, okay, it's not settled yet. It's not done and dusted, but America has basically put down the marker and said, ours. Ukraine, they've handed the ball to Europe and said, yours, and you need to copy our economic model to be able to succeed in that particular task. Then they can pivot to Asia. The Middle East, if Iran topples, well, okay, the Middle East is never resolved, trust me. you solve a problem and you create a problem, but America is infinitely better placed from a geopolitical perspective right now than it was just a few months ago.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I think many people have mistaken the America First playbook, for lack of a better way of saying it, and the refocusing on the Western Hemisphere. And, one of the comments that I have made is, a guy named Michael J. McNair. I don't know if you know Michael, another Michael, right? I've interacted with him a little bit. I don't know him personally at this point, but he wrote a good review of the national security strategy document that the U.S. put out back in November. And the key line that he wrote in there, which I immediately grabbed because I thought it nailed it, was he said the confusion comes from mistaking prioritization for abandonment. And so I think a lot of people have said, this is the U.S. pulling back, and not only are they pulling back because they want to, but they're pulling back because they have to. They've been defeated on the global stage. They can no longer compete. Their military is no longer what it used to be. They're finally realizing it, and they're retreating back to their own neighborhood, and they're going to try to throw their weight around in their own neighborhood. And to me, this is just it's a misinterpretation. And so when Michael McNair said that, I thought it perfectly summed it up, because, in some ways, coming back and focusing on your own neighborhood and strengthening your own backyard allows you to then force project to an even greater extent if and when you decide to do so. And I think we've seen that in the last year, or even the last 6 months. The U.S. has still been involved in Ukraine. The U.S. has still been involved in Iran. They flew, a bombing mission through the airspace of Iran unopposed on the other side of the world and came home with no lives lost. And so the idea that Donald Trump wants to, retreat from the global stage and the cameras of the world is about as silly as a notion as I can imagine. And I think that misinterpretation of that national security document is part of the misunderstanding of what the United States is actually trying to achieve. And, I know I'm kind of rambling here, but God, I just love talking about this stuff with you. Is, if you have said for a long time that the people who think that Trump doesn't have a plan are insane, for lack of a better way of saying it. You might not like the plan. You may think it's misguided. You may think he has no chance in hell of pulling it off, but there is a plan. And if you zoom out and you look at it, what's going on in Greenland, what's going on in Venezuela, what's going on in the Middle East, this is all the stuff that you've been talking about would eventually have to come to pass at some point or another. But here, it's here, right? It's no longer at some point. It is here now.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me try and unpack that in a couple of different ways.
It was a lot. I know.
First of all, no problem at all. First point I want to make is this. Yeah, there are a lot of people looking at what Trump's doing with the Monroe Doctrine, which again is completely logical. In fact, on the day he was reelected, I mentioned it in terms of the policies I expect to see, which is remember the Monroe Doctrine, I said. And in fact, I mentioned the Panama Canal specifically. I said, if America built that, America used to own it and gave it away for $1. That's not the kind of deal that Donald Trump will like. He'll try and reverse that. That's just part of the bigger picture there in terms of the done right.
And that's one of the first places he sent State Department officials after he was in.
Yeah, well, even before he was in, he was already.
Even before. Even before.
Yeah. So it's very clear that America does see itself as having what we call a sphere of influence. That's absolutely clear. Okay, it's made that basically on the record again now. But here's the key point. The people who thought that that wasn't a Trump plan now say, but the other part of the plan is he's going to give Europe and Ukraine to Russia and is going to give all of Asia to China. No, that's not how spheres of influence work. Not if you actually really, really want to maintain primacy, which Trump clearly does and the US clearly does. The way you do that, if you've ever played Risk, which is what we're basically playing now, you hold your territory and then you hold the borders of the other continent that the other team has so that they don't basically have the set and get more powerful. I mean, it's that simple in board game terms. So you don't let Asia fall to China because that will in time make them more important than you, because rich as the Americas are together, Asia, more populous, can probably do far better, particularly given the industrial head start that China has now, which is huge and should never be underplayed.
America absolutely.
Decades of catching up to do, but you don't allow that to then be reinforced by saying, and all of Asia is yours, losing Japan, losing South Korea, losing the Philippines, losing Taiwan, etc., etc. And in Russia's case, you try and basically back away from that and let Europe step up and do it, but you don't want Europe to roll over because you don't want a Eurasian bloc, which ultimately can threaten you in the Atlantic on the other side. You just want Europe to do their bloody job and actually step up and actually be prepared to fight Russia if necessary, which, to be frank, they can't do at the moment. They're basically like a wet paper bag. Anything you put in just falls out the bottom. And I know that they're now talking about this big defense step up, and the European press are full of it. Yeah, and they are full of it, to use a different analogy, because it's 2035 before they actually get to that target. And it's a moving target. America's talked about increasing the defense budget by 50% next year. I don't think that will happen, but you can see what they're talking about. Russia is all in.
And just so people know what these numbers are, he's suggesting going from just under 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion per year. Now rather than thinking of that just in budgetary terms, think of it compared to QE. At the height of QE, they were doing something like, 150 billion a month. And so over a 1 year period, that's $1.52 trillion. And that goes to the banks, who then have to take a second step of using that to provide new credit to push assets higher.
Which they didn't do.
which they didn't initially do, right?
Yeah.
This is basically the size of the QE programs, but it is going right into the economy immediately. There's no second step. And so I think that I just bring that up because the numbers are incredible, but it also speaks to the fact that the United States is not just going to roll over and become a second-class citizen on the world stage. How this ultimately plays out, I don't know for sure, but I know they're not just going to roll over and start giving away influence.
No, completely agree. So that's something, again, that needs to be absorbed and is rejected by far too many people, or is accepted, but then the plan itself is rejected. So you say, well, we get that, but we don't accept what America is doing. But what I think is really crucial here, and this is a theme I'm going to be exploring in more detail over the next couple of days. I hope to be publishing on it as soon as I can get it finished. I actually think that we're seeing some really interesting historical parallels right now. I like history. I like economic history.
Love it.
But it never repeats itself, but it rhymes, as Mark Twain famously said, and is quoted to death as having said. Yes, we're in a new Cold War. It's not like the last one because we're so integrated. Yes, there's a parallel with the pre-World War I period where deeply integrated economies ended up splitting and fighting each other. Yes, there's a parallel with the 1930s in terms of the domestic polarization that we're seeing and the rise of extremism on the far left and the far right the way around the world, which is, deeply, deeply disturbing and all part of this mess, because if you don't have political control, you don't get anything done. But where I think we see a really interesting parallel with the US, and this puts slightly more nuance in terms of the rather bullish position we're putting forward, because I am bullish, right? But I'm aware that there are risks. This is not a Hollywood movie where things are done in 90 minutes, explosion, done, thank you. It's not all like Maduro, right? There's a lot of harder things to take care of.
Real quick, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to make a point real quick. I think this is important for people to understand, is Michael and I, we actually think this can end up being bullish. A lot of people assume the fall of the liberal world order automatically means chaos and ash and ruin. And it's not that can't happen, but we may end up there eventually, but in my opinion, we could see growth and perhaps fantastic growth prior to that. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I kind of wanted to make that point. We're not sitting here necessarily predicting doom and gloom. Volatility, no, but not necessarily doom and gloom.
Completely. In fact, I'm going to come back to that as part of the next thing that I want to say here now. So I'm going to shock a few people listening, I think, and stretch the memories of those who are younger. But Google is your friend, right? So get out there and use your AI, do some reading around it. I actually think there's a distinct parallel between where Trump is now and President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. And I say that.
Interesting. I know.
I say that because
go ahead.
He inherited a superpower in 1985, and it was completely stagnant. The Soviet Union was a superpower. It was fantastic at producing military stuff. It was terrible at producing consumer stuff. They had a command economy which didn't have any issues with profitability because it didn't exist. It was basically do it. So talk about fiat, just do that. But they destroyed value with most of what they were making. But they could flood the world Kalashnikovs with good, cheap tanks, with reasonable fighter jets, et cetera, et cetera. And they controlled around a third of the world's population. This was a serious foe for the US, a serious opponent. And you'd had periods of confrontation and, almost warfare, periods of proxy warfare, and periods of denial. But overall, of course, they were enemies. So Gorbachev comes in, and the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, appoint him because they recognize they need to reform. They need to move towards embracing consumer goods to keep people happy alongside the military goods. Now, I'm going to describe in the piece I put out in much more detail how the Soviet economy worked, because I studied that.
That's why I love this. This is why I love talking to you. You go ahead.
Okay, well, I thought it was my sparkling personality.
No, this is great.
So basically, I'm not going to go into finite detail now because everyone will fall asleep. But the whole point is the system couldn't be reformed. They tried partial reforms. They didn't work. Then they had to accelerate them. And gradually, the system just collapsed. In fact, there was an attempted coup against Gorbachev with people saying, let's rewind the clock.
Yeah.
Because once you started to play around with the command economy and introduce market mechanisms to it, everything collapses. It's like a table where you need to change all four legs at once, but you can't do all four at once. So you take away one, the table falls over and you lose all your food. Okay. So it was a disaster. Then we got radical market reformers that came in and really decimated Russia. And that's a whole different story. But the Gorbachev era is prescient because what he was trying to do was introduce basically glasnost, which is radical transparency, and perestroika, which is reforms. Well, Trump is all about glasnost, freedom of speech. Everyone can say everything, even if it's offensive. It's a controversial political point, but there's a parallel there. And he is trying perestroika. He's trying to take a US economy, which is all about consumption, and make it more about the military.
It's reverse perestroika. It's reverse perestroika is what it is.
He needs to move towards a more command economy whilst not blowing up the consumer side. Now, again, I don't want to get into the intricacies of that, but the system works in reverse. For example, once you start saying, what is GDP for? You start asking, well, what's the Fed for? And that brings us to all the hoo-ha with Powell at the moment, okay? What are interest rates for? Who are they for? You start controlling everything and commanding everything, and then market forces can disappear and you go too far, right? So he has to make sure he doesn't blow the whole thing up the way that Gorbachev did. And if he does get it wrong, we can see that obviously people would like to get rid of Trump. You don't have to look too far to see people who would like to depose him or weaken him the way that Gorbachev was deposed in a coup, effectively. And things can fall apart, at which point, the bull case for America falls apart, I think, even if markets would rally to a degree short term. And other forces globally who are better at command economies and mixing that with a market economy. China, for example, has an incredibly powerful mixture of market forces and a command economy, which means that they can outproduce America 250 to 1 in terms of shipbuilding. 250 to 1. That's just mind-blowing, okay? So things can fall apart. But if he succeeds, then you have a very different American economy, which frankly offends a great deal of vested interests.
You have a much different different global economy as well. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, this is the last point. I just want to bring it back to what you said about the growth. It's better for the consumer, ironically, because you get consumption based on income rather than borrowing. So the middleman who's lending to the consumer doesn't do well. You're already seeing that in terms of supply side reforms that Trump's trying to push through to push down costs, and where he's attacking things like meat packers and health insurance companies, okay? But let's look more broadly. One thing in the national security strategy, which I'm guessing here, I'm being a bit cheeky, but I'm guessing maybe even your good self might have overlooked in the text of it. When they wrote about Latin America and the Dunroe Doctrine, they made very clear they want cheap commodities from Latin America.
Yes.
Who doesn't want cheap commodities? That's good old-fashioned Yankee imperialismo, okay? Imperialism. But they add in the text quite specifically, we want this as part of a reindustrialization of Latin America in parallel with a reindustrialization of America, which is actually in line with Adam Smith's original concept, whereby, and even David Ricardo, whereby you industrialize in your own economy and you trade at the margin. You don't invest all your capital in a cheap country and produce everything there and then borrow from them to buy their goods and be a consumer, not a producer. So what they want actually is an inclusive, more fair, more equitable imperialism, if you will, which demolishes the neoliberal, liberal-based order, which was a neoliberal-based order.
Right.
So it's really genuinely revolutionary in a way that transcends left and right traditions of the past 45 years. Okay, I'll stop now because I'm going too far.
No. But so I actually did not overlook that.
Okay.
and I'm actually, once the fireworks are over, and maybe even before the fireworks are over, because there will be fireworks. If this is to succeed, there is still some more fireworks that need to go off. But I'm becoming increasingly bullish on Central and South America. For exactly the reasons you have very, very well elucidated. Now, I have to say something. I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, but I think a lot of the times people will say this absolutely is not going to happen. At best, it's going to take 10 years, 15 years for the U.S. to reindustrialize and to rebuild manufacturing, and the cost of the inflation that will happen in the meantime will prevent them from being able to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not that that is necessarily wrong, but I think when people are saying that, they are assuming that manufacturing will be done over the next 20 years in the same, or 50 years, in the same way it's been done for the last 20 or 50 years. But with innovation, with AI, with being able to 3D print, on site, I don't know that manufacturing will necessarily look the same way it did over the next 5 years or 10 years, the same way it did for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that innovation, which regardless of all the problems the United States has, the United States does, in my opinion, still have the greatest entrepreneurs and innovators in the world. And the people that automatically dismiss these people, I think, are doing them a disservice. And so I think if they are able to kind of have a manufacturing renaissance coupled with innovation and doing things in a different way and doing it with partners in Latin and South America, I don't think it takes as long especially if there's a, initiative, almost a war-based initiative to get it done. I don't think it necessarily takes as long as a lot of the assumptions that you often read of this, 10, 15, 20 years are laid out as.
I agree completely. I am also of the very, very, strong opinion that there are numerous self-inflicted wounds to heal, given where critical
innumerable
supply chain. I mean, so many times you hear people say, I want to do X, we haven't got the skilled labor. Okay. I want to do Y, all the components are made in China, we've just shifted them there. Or we rely on this company, which relies on someone who relies on China. So untangling that Gordian knot is going to be really tricky. And let me be blunt, I don't think it can be done with the system that we have had until now and still have right now. But as soon as you take control of the Fed and Treasury, all things become possible. And in fact, let me just segue to one other thing, because this runs in all directions, which is why this job is so exciting, or this role I have is so exciting and so frustrating, because you have to talk to so many different people, try and explain this totality of vision to all of them, and they're all in their own little silo, and most of them reject it. So the Fed, I think everyone should agree, is a battleground here. If one can't see that after the headlines of the past few days, you're in the wrong job. Seriously, if you're not writing about this, covering that, you are in the wrong job, because this is what it's all about. And it will change the whole political economy of the US and the global system. But let's go to something completely different. Not my strong point, okay? So I'm on thin ice here, although you'll see why I'm using thin ice as an analogy. China, the South China Morning Post, a Hong Kong newspaper, just had an article this morning just saying it's power, China's power. They have cheap electricity.
Yeah.
Electricity. They're producing more and more electricity, cheaper and cheaper. Everywhere else in the world, and I don't want to get controversial in terms of what policies are and aren't causing it, but I think that most people know what is and isn't a driver. We're getting higher and higher electricity costs, and we're not producing more and more of it. Trump's just turned around and said to AI companies, you need to be responsible for your own electricity costs rather than the consumer. I don't know how that's going to work, but that really passes the buck to them to solve that problem in a big way. But I've seen Elon Musk talking about the fact that they think infinite power, cheap power can come from space, solar panels up in space, et cetera, et cetera. Where on Earth, and I mean literally, where on the globe, has the best geostationary location to not constantly be rotating, and where you can absolutely guarantee it's easiest to get up and down?
Venezuela.
Well, Venezuela's pretty good.
Yeah.
So basically different locations. Yeah, and where? Greenland.
Yeah, I know. You're not off. The ice was, thin ice was interesting because you're talking about Greenland, and maybe some people are thinking of global warming, but no, I think you are absolutely. It's funny. I said the other day that one of the unspoken benefits of having a Venezuela that was not, counter to the United States interests, was as a launching site to space, and that's in the future. Space is going to be a more important thing, and the closer you are to the equator or the poles, the more stable it is to do that. And so I think both of those locations, I think you're right on. You're right on track. One thing before we get off this topic, okay, there's so many ways this topic can go. One of the things I think you're aware of it. I know we've communicated about it a little bit, but going back to, if you control the Fed and if you control the Treasury, and if you also have the executive branch and you have the Congress in your favor, that certainly helps in a command economy. So 2 points I would make on this. Number one, and then finally, the innovation. Well, this has kind of gone overlooked, I think, but there is a small but extremely powerful department within what's now called the Department of War, called the Office of Strategic Capital. And this is essentially the way this office is going to act as the quarterback to coordinate all the different resources and organizations and branches of the United States, both on a private and public basis, to bring funding to companies and industries and market sectors that the United States deems critical to national security and economic renaissance. And they are going to fund these industries and these companies, going forward, almost as if it is a national security issue. Not almost, as if it is a national security issue. And this goes towards innovation. It goes towards manufacturing. It goes towards defense. And we've actually figured out a way to participate in this, thankfully, because I think this is one of the biggest tailwinds that markets are going to see over the next 5 or 10 years. And it's one of the biggest tailwinds I have seen in doing this for 25 years. But one point I want to make, and you feel free to tell me if you think I'm wrong here, but I already know there's a lot of people out there saying, well, yes, but this is just a further entrenchment of the government getting involved in the private markets. It is, and governments are historically horrible allocators of capital. This is exactly why the Soviet Union ended up failing in the late 80s, early 90s. And this is going to end really, really bad for the United States. And this is just a further evidence of how far they have fallen. And the point I would make is, yes, governments are not typically historically very good at allocating capital. And the further entrenched government gets in private industry, that probably doesn't bode well necessarily long term. But that doesn't mean it won't be extremely successful in the short term. And if you think otherwise, then how the heck has China done what they've done with a command economy over the last 25 years? So and China is starting to see some of the problems with that, right? Their growth has slowed dramatically. Their debts have ballooned incredibly, and they're starting to deal with some of the problems of that state-financed production. But it's been 25 years, and they're still here. Right. And so the idea that just because the United States is going to start doing this, that they're necessarily going to fall next month or next year, I think is to miss the historical record here. So, I don't necessarily like this. I'm a free markets guy. I'm a live and let live guy. But that a free market and live and let live is not the world I live in. It's perhaps a beautiful fantasy of mine, but it's just not reality. And so I think those who are automatically dismissing the chances that the United States has to compete or become more competitive in these arenas, again, I just think the odds aren't as bad as many people think that they are.
Well, first of all, yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Just as an aside, before I give the rest of the answer, if you could just tell me,
yeah,
I've seen like 200 billion flying around as the figure that's coming out of this. But from what I understand, and this is where I think it's very, very, very clever, and in fact, it speaks to what I was describing as using financial fartcraft to prepare for a World of Warcraft. Yeah. They're not putting 200 billion in. I think it's a tiny fraction of that they're putting in, but they can generate 200 billion, if I'm correct, right?
That's exactly right. And they're partnering with private capital. So
there you go.
People like me will be putting up capital. They will be matching it. And, there's a way through credit, the extension of credit, and, preferential financing that you can get financing to firms that might not otherwise get it, or that might need a longer runway than they normally would, because what they're producing is needed from a national security perspective, et cetera, et cetera. And so in other words, it's not just a typical government spending program. And by the way, the guy that's running this is a guy named Steve Feinberg. And Steve Feinberg is the founder and chairman of Cerberus, which is one of the biggest and most successful private equity firms in history. He's made billions of dollars for himself and his clients over the years. And this guy hates losing money. If you think that he has decided to ride off into the sunset of his career into a government job where they just waste money, you do not know who Steve Feinberg is. And so, it's a little different than a typical government spending program.
Sure.
Now
You don't have to send it to me.
No, I know. I'm just for people listening. For people listening, I think this is it's not very well known right now, but I think in the next couple of years it's going to become very well known. So now I have a.
Sorry, can I say that very quickly? Because I wanted to just get that leverage part addressed, because this exactly speaks to what I was saying. What is GDP for? They've made a decision. GDP is for this. So that's why I'm also bullish on that. And then remember on from it.
Remember that $200 billion number. That's from a year ago. That's pre-Trump wanting to take the military budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion.
Right. Okay. So even bigger.
Yeah.
But from a first, sorry, can I just one?
Yeah, dude. We're just talking
from a first principles perspective, because I'm all about first principles. It's just how I think. I wanted to just come back to what you said about being willing to do it. It's not something you want to do, etc. You wouldn't want to see the government doing it, but we think. I agree that this will work. I'm maybe slightly more European in the. I like markets too. Obviously, I work for the private sector. But if you think the private sector doesn't misallocate capital, you've never worked in the private sector.
Fair enough. Touche.
I mean, seriously, you want to see money wasted?
Absolutely.
Go to the private sector. The only difference is that we have a bankruptcy system, which traditionally wiped those people out, got rid of those companies and replaced them with someone who was more sensible. That's the only thing separating government from the private sector. So if A, government is more efficient, that can work just as well. If B, government works out a way of having a bankruptcy system within it, that still works just as well. And C, I would say within the economy we have now, which is why we need reverse perestroika, that bankruptcy is going away. You're seeing these giant zombie firms make mistake after mistake after mistake and not be punished because they're just so big. They can get away with it. It's like, we screwed the pooch and lost $10 billion. What are you going to do? Let's just keep going. I mean, I don't want to name names specifically because I don't manage money. But I mean, I remember a certain large tech company investing an awful lot of money in the delusion that everybody wanted to get back to what was it called? Second Life, which was, trendy like 15 years ago. And absolutely, surprise, surprise, nobody was interested in having a digital avatar of themselves with a mustache. How much money was burned by that mistake, right? If that was a government department doing it, that would be all over the front pages saying they took our taxpayers' money. Well, they just took shareholders' money in.
Yeah. We works another one, right?
Well, I'm again not naming names, but sorry. So I think it will work, yes. And I think you're right. China shows that there are temporal compromises you can make which combine the dynamism of the state and the dynamism of the private sector with the guidance of the state. And that's the sweet spot. That's the reverse perestroika. Trump needs to aim for.
That's right. Okay, so I have a surprise question for you, but before I hit you with the surprise question, I've got to give you. I mean, I already think you're a genius, so you already know that. No, I do. I literally really do. But you have made a number of, I don't know, let's just call them predictions for lack of a better word, things that you thought that would happen in the years ahead. And, whether we start in 2016 or 19 or 22, like a lot of the stuff that you and I have been talking about is starting to come true. You were, I think, ahead of me in this stuff, but you've certainly helped me kind of develop my framework. The single best prediction, in my opinion, that you made that has started to show some hints of coming true. People aren't even going to believe this, but several years ago, you said to me, or in some format, you communicated to me that before this is all over with, letters of marque are going to come back as a real thing. The reason I bring this up is that you didn't hear, but when I was introducing you before you came on screen, in addition to the Lenin quote, I used the quote, "If you want to know the future, look to the past." Now, letters of marque, I think, were last popular 300 years ago or 200, whatever, 200 or 300 years ago. And you a couple of years ago, or whenever it was, mentioned that letters of marque are going to come back. And I'll be damned if 2 months ago or whenever it was, that wasn't floated as an idea with the drug boats coming from South America to the United States. So I have to give you, everybody needs to know that you made this prediction, and it isn't fully here, but it is now within the Overton window of what's allowed to be discussed.
Well, thank you so much for that. I mean, really, it's just a logical extension of what you were just talking about with strategic capital. Because for those who don't know what they are, letters of marque are something in the US Constitution which can still be issued by Congress now, which effectively, and other countries like the UK or the England used them long beforehand, where you effectively legalize piracy. So, some of our greatest mariners in English naval history were effectively pirates, and we said to them,
privateers, right?
And privateers, go and raid the Spanish boats for all the gold. You give 20%, 30% for the government, you get to keep the rest. What are you doing? You're incentivizing the private sector and get out there and do what your Navy isn't capable of doing. So I still think that there's a logical argument for the US to do that at some point when they just say, right, we need to interdict X, Y, or Z. Or if they start saying Russian oil, okay, anyone who can manage to seize a Russian oil tanker, you get to keep half the cargo. Or you get to keep half the profits when it's sold. Okay, does it have downsides? Yeah, absolutely. Are there risks involved with that? No brainer. But if you need to get something done geopolitically, when you don't have the state capacity to do it, but the private sector could more efficiently motivate itself and militarize itself to a degree and get out there, why wouldn't you do that? So yeah, I would be very surprised if in years ahead, particularly as America realizes it needs to be a naval power again, which it's really, really been ignoring for far too long. Like your merchant marine is just like, you can count the number of ships on the fingers of one hand. China's got thousands of merchant marine vessels, which are now, as I've also flagged in the past, capable of being militarized. You can put drones in shipping containers, and then when they sail into your port, you think you're getting a widescreen TV. No, you get 10,000 drones which come in and blow up your port and your fuel services around there and all the infrastructure, wiping you out completely. That's already now existing as military technology. So Trump's taken one step forward and one step back vis-a-vis the merchant marine and China, because at the moment we still have China with strong hands on rare earths and industrial supply chains, etc. But, pivoting back to Venezuela and everything, all that we're seeing is Trump attempt to build cards as leverage in terms of supply chains against China to say to them, while we decouple from you and reindustrialize and build up alternative supply chains, if you cut us off from X, Y, Z, so, we're like in a COVID crisis overnight, we'll cut you off from ABC. It's a balance of terror.
Well, I think, okay, I don't want to forget to ask this next question, but I do want to follow up on a point you just made. And I think a lot of people, with regard to Venezuela, think that the United States is going in to steal the oil. And it's not that isn't possible, right? Of course, oil is a big part of the reason the United States is involved in Venezuela. But even if the United States never sells a barrel of oil of Venezuela's and never receives 1 penny of economic value from doing that, what they have done or what they are doing is keeping from China from doing it. So they are cutting off the supply, even though they're not using it themselves, they are keeping a competitor from doing it. And the same thing would happen if Iran were to fall. All of a sudden, you would have 2 of the biggest sources of energy that supplies China all of a sudden in disarray. And so it's not so, it's a form of control. The word I've used for it is physical censorship, or censorship in the physical realm. You're keeping somebody else from doing, what you don't want them to do.
Completely. On Venezuela, I put a piece out in December called Venezuela Vidi Vici.
There you go.
And it made the same point. And Iran too. If China can't have it, in fact, there are so many great quotes from Dune about all this. Of course, it's one of the great, literary texts. He who can control a thing, he who can destroy a thing can control a thing.
Exactly. That was That was literally Goldfinger's strategy in
Yeah.
the movie, the original James Bond movie. He,
Yeah.
he took the gold out of circulation by,
Yeah.
you're radiating it, or that was the plan anyway.
And I mean, and by the way, that works on multiple levels. Because say, for example, if you do ever get Venezuela oil back on track, if you do, you've got that very close to home with the US military controlling those supply chains. And at the same time, that means you could have accidents happening in other areas which China does rely on, and you have low energy prices.
Yeah,
China has high, because this is part of the great game being played. Both teams want to have low prices for what they need and make the other team pay high prices.
Yeah.
So you are getting a bifurcation of global commodity streams, which people are not factoring in yet. But this global bifurcation means that cheap energy for me, expensive for you. Cheap, like look at rare earths in China, look at the price in the West.
Yep.
What does that do downstream? Price differential. Okay. So you're going to get a lot more of that, but both sides will try and play the same game where they can. And, whether that ends badly, as we said, in dust and smoke, etc., or whether it's just a balance of terror and a peaceful demarcation of zones of influence or spheres of influence, and, and a rebalanced economy within them, that's all open to question. We have to track that day by day. But that's the game.
Absolutely. Okay. So I've already said that a lot of what you have predicted over the last, 5-10 years has been very prescient, and we're starting to see play out in real time. And I've talked about how you made this amazing prediction on Letters of Marque. So here's the question. You have made so many accurate predictions. What has happened in the last year that has surprised you?
Okay. Radical honesty here, because I don't like giving answers that are kind of bit of this, bit of that. I was, as someone who spends a lot of his time in the long grass of the pockets of social media where ideas percolate up long before they get mentioned in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, I was blindsided, and I'm genuinely embarrassed about it because I regard myself as being good at this, by how rapidly what we could call the Groyper phenomenon suddenly appeared in MAGA world, where you had a much more extreme far-right iteration of MAGA eclipsing MAGA. And we still don't know how large that is within the grouping, whether Trump remains the daddy now. Well, obviously he remains the daddy now, but what's happening next? You can look at more conservative interpretations of that, of is it Rubio versus Vance, for 2028, etc. That kind of elbow jostling for position. But it was a surprise to me to see how a coalition that looked like it was lining up to be able to force through reverse perestroika against a very, very strong opposition in terms of the entrenchment of an anti-Trump Gorbachev, a coalition within the US economy as a whole, or the political economy, suddenly starting to tear itself apart at the margins, as we've previously seen on the left. Now, I don't know how that will play out. I'm starting to formulate, different permutations of that. But that genuinely surprised me. And if you think that's too obscure, or anyone listening thinks this is really, really an odd thing to throw in there and it doesn't fit, I can assure you it does. Because if you suddenly say that I can predict, this is a silly example, but it's kind of relevant. Trump is suddenly going to start buying a brand of shoe with notoriously hard to tie shoelaces, which statistically see people fall downstairs more often. And that he's going up and down from Air Force One more often. You suddenly start factoring in, what if he has a tumble?
Yeah.
What does MAGA look like without Trump? And suddenly you start asking all those questions. Okay, this is, I'm making that one up just spur of the moment.
No.
But you get my drift. Small things can multiply. And this isn't actually a small thing. If that political coalition fractures, potentially you start opening up the what if for 2026 of the midterms. And for 2028, the what if you get Gavin Newsom as president, for example, purely random. What does that do to the great game? And these are questions which I'm already being asked by people, by stakeholders, clients, etc. And we don't have to unpack that now because it's a whole different topic, but it does contain a series of very, very different answers to the ones that you might otherwise have put forward in some respects. Some are the same and some are very, very different.
Yeah. So I'll tell you the thing that surprised. So great answer, and I think you're spot on because it's funny. I've been playing around with this concept recently that it's I call it the fractal of fractures, fractal fractures, because everywhere you look, both domestically U.S. and internationally, and in all different kinds of institutions and groupings, you see fractures.
Yes.
And that little fracture is just a fractal of a bigger fracture.
Yeah.
And then that's a fractal of a bigger fracture. And
yeah, beautifully put.
And so I think you've kind of honed in on a small fractal, but it has the potential to be a very big fractal. And especially as we move towards the midterms and then the next election. I'll tell you the thing that surprised me. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this because listen, Venezuela was in no way a surprise. Anybody who didn't see Venezuela coming is literally living under a rock, right? Like they've put a damn armada, a couple 100 miles south of me here. It's very obvious what was going to happen, but the way that it happened was surprising to me. And I'll tell you why. I mean, it was very clear something was going to happen. It was very clear there was going to be an attempt at a minimum of regime change. But to do it in the way that he did it, and when I say he, I mean Trump, because it was so perfectly executed and so quickly done and so successful, I don't think people have a proper respect for how risky of a political move that was. Perhaps not super risky from a military perspective, but from a political perspective, incredibly risky. Because they literally put boots on the ground in a foreign country that is allied with two of our biggest enemies or adversaries without congressional approval. If even one U.S. service member, let alone 2, 3, 4, or 5, had been shot, injured, or God forbid, killed, I don't know that he would survive that outcome. When I say he survived, I mean Trump. And so regardless of whether you think it should have happened or shouldn't have happened, I mean, that can be debated forever. You do have to admit that was a very gutsy call to do it in the way that he did it. Oh, and it's a big win for Trump that it worked out the way that, whether you like him or hate him, that was a big win for Trump.
Completely. And look, I, like yourself, I often find myself having to say, this isn't about Trump per se, because he's such a polarizing figure. And to be honest, we should just have it as a disclaimer at the bottom and just get on with it, because otherwise it just goes on and on forever, right? But no, it was a very ballsy decision. In fact, frankly, I am really, really professionally getting sick and tired of the taco meme.
Yeah.
Trump always chickens out. It is constantly used by people who don't understand how many risks he has taken. Genuinely. I mean, he was nearly assassinated, for example, right? How many times he has come close to things that would be catastrophic if they went wrong, but he's prepared to roll the dice to see if they go right. Now, that doesn't mean everything he touches is golden, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, that was a staggeringly audacious move. And to rewind back to where we were, it, to a degree, has reset the board. It has reset the board.
Totally. It has completely reset the board.
Yeah. Also, by the way, and I don't want to start getting into any kind of conspiracy theory territory here. I'm quite measured on everything I say, or I try to be measured, even if I'm flippant. If you read some of the reports on the ground from what people saw happening there, they're referring to new weapons that, frankly, we've only heard mentioned in terms of like Havana syndrome, which, by the way, all the information knows that is now pointing to being a Russian weapon, actually, that does exist.
It's funny. I just had a conversation with somebody who knows exactly about that about a month ago.
So again, this is something you're not going to get on the front page of the FT. And if you're reading Bloomberg, the FT, and Wall Street Journal only, and you think you know what's going on in the world, I can assure you, you don't. But directed energy beams, to take people out, one wonders how much else there is in the tank that hasn't been used yet. and is constantly being alluded to. And that can only help the US geostrategic position. And to bring it back down to markets, because that's what you do. You manage money. I talk to people who manage money or who run large firms and small firms, and are trying to manage their money within that envelope, to make sure that the firm doesn't lose more on its FX position in a year than it makes on growing crop A, B, or C, which is a real risk, for firms if you don't watch markets. That cannot be anything but good for the US, even if the dollar has a down week, a down day, or a down month, because the US wants it to.
Yeah.
It's the reality is, as you always keep saying, it's all about power, and it is all about power.
So, Michael, we've been talking for about an hour. I don't know if you have any more time, but I've got an additional question that I definitely want to discuss if you have a few more minutes.
In for a penny, in for a pound, as we say in the UK.
Okay, good. Well, you just brought up the dollar, and it's hard to believe we've been talking for an hour, and that's the first time either one of us said anything about the dollar. But the dollar is essentially all about power. I mean, it is a weapon both domestically and internationally. And I've gone on record several times saying that money is a weapon, and it is perhaps the United States' greatest weapon. But we have not talked yet about stablecoins, and I'm of the belief. Thank God I finally saw it. That's all I'm going to say, because stablecoins are not new. They've been around for 10 years or whatever it is. And I made an almost unforgivable mistake. And I'll use this as an example for anybody else living or listening of not to do this. When stablecoins first kind of came out, I studied them pretty hard, and I looked at them, and I did not like, that's an emotional word, which you should not use when, looking at investments, but I did not like some of the people and some of the firms that were involved with stablecoins. And as a result, I let my dislike for the people involved influence my decision to ignore the technology involved. And so, I kind of went down the rabbit hole on stablecoins a couple different times, and I just didn't like it. And so I put it aside. And what made me take a third look at it was the passage of the Genius Act. And the United States, from a state perspective, essentially sanctioned, or, saying these are good, we like them, we are going to incorporate this technology going forward. And I was like, why are they doing that? Right. And so I went back down the rabbit hole, and I started thinking about it, and I started looking at it, and oh my God, I think the US dollar stablecoins have the potential to be the biggest game changer of all.
Yes.
Because I think it is literally a stealth weapon that 99% of the people in the world don't understand how it could be used. And the few that do understand how it could be used are misdiagnosing the extent to which the other 99% will adopt it. I think the people that really understand it have some really good reasons why it should not be adopted. I think that they are such a small group, and I think they're misdiagnosing what the other 99% of the people in the world will do, given the opportunity to use these things. And I think I'm very glad that I went back down the rabbit hole again, because I don't know that I'm right. It's very possible. I always have to say it's possible that I'm wrong. But if I am right, and if I'm even a little bit right, this has the potential to be an enormous impact on not just economics, but geopolitics over the next 5 or 10 years. So anyway, that's what I want to talk to you about. If you've got any thoughts.
No, share. Of course. Well, look, again, we were on a parallel path here. That I hated crypto from day one. I may even have made the joke with you. I made it with many others. I called it crapto, imprint, because for me it was all monkeys in sunglasses nonsense. And I kept saying to people, "What's it for?" going back to my shtick, what's it for? And they're like, well, you can make money from it. Great. Okay. You can make money from selling drugs. You can make money from anything. What's it actually for? What social good is there? And briefly, of course, we came to the point where it was nearly banned completely, because under the Biden admin, at one point, so many people were flipping NFTs and pictures of monkeys in sunglasses. People weren't turning up for work to flip burgers. And it's like, okay, great. Let's just disrupt the entire labor force where everyone sits at home speculating and no one produces anything. It's like the madness of neoliberal economics taken to its furthest extreme. It's like, we're all millionaires. No one does anything. We all just sell pictures of monkeys in sunglasses to each other. I can't tell you how ridiculous the concept was. Then, again, with the same path as yourself, the Genius Act, I realized, no, I see what they're for. Dollar stablecoins are part of this Trumpian reverse perestroika and economic statecraft. And I'll be blunt, the tech side of it doesn't interest me at all. I'm quite a Luddite. If people tell me the technology works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I don't need to know how it works in the middle. Not my bag, okay? Not at all. What I'm interested in is the balance sheets, because from the very outset, again, my first principle is kind of like a spider sense was tingling. I'm like, hang on. If this works the way I think it can work, it's the equivalent of talking to someone who understands Newtonian physics and bringing in Einsteinian physics and quantum theory and quantum dynamics and or the nuclear process, which, at the beginning of the 20th century was happening. Some people were talking about splitting the atom when others were still talking about the movement of celestial bodies. You're on two different planes of existence conceptually. And one of them had the power to kick the other one's butt. And it really did, as we saw with the Manhattan Project. And stablecoins are similar because it's a way to basically maintain dollar global hegemony without the Triffin paradox. You don't have that problem that everyone demanding dollars as part of the milkshake, which of course you're, incredibly and rightly famous for, and which I found very influential to my thinking. You don't have that in the same way if effectively you have a new instrument, which is a token for a dollar rather than a dollar, but is treated as a dollar, but isn't a dollar and exists on a separate balance sheet and exists outside the banking system as a separate liability, potentially, and which is adopted globally and which America still controls, but without going through all the paperwork that it has now. It's absolute. I'd have to draw it to show sketches to people in terms of the balance sheet. You can't describe it verbally, but the balance sheets change, the flows change, and you go 3 dimensions rather than 2, and you basically entrench American power in a whole new dimension. It's staggering what they could achieve. And again, very, very few people get it. But what I'll say is this. In the same way in 2024, I said 2025 is going to be a shocker because we'll get economic statecraft, and we did. And everyone is still kind of hung up on Liberation Day tariffs. And I said, this is just the beginning. Well, now we've got Venezuela. Now we've got Iran. That's still just the beginning. When we get the control of the Fed and when we get stable coins, that's when the real rubber hits the road.
Yeah. And for anybody listening who is not already kind of, familiar with this topic or hasn't studied it, there is no way that Michael and I can dig into all of this today. That's just impossible. I'm going to give a little plug here. I wrote a pretty long report about it that laid out my thesis back in October. It's available on our website. I'll even put the link for it into the description of this video for those who are interested. But essentially, in addition to everything Michael has said, it is a way for the United States essentially to steal sovereignty from another country. And the reason I say that is if another country adopts US dollar stablecoins as opposed to their local fiat currency, which is not helping them in any way, shape, or form, it undermines the local authorities' ability to have control over both their populace and their economy. And any country that loses control of its currency ultimately loses control of the country, because money and power are synonymous. They go together like a hand and a glove. They don't have to, but they do. And this is a way for, in much the same way that the world adopted the euro dollar as global money because it was the quickest, the cheapest, the most efficient, the most in demand. The world built themselves a euro dollar prison because they had all this euro dollar debt in a currency that they could not control. This is a new form of a euro dollar that can move just as fast, actually faster than a euro dollar. And it can go not only to existing institutions, but it can go towards the individuals and the unbanked who have traditionally not had access to the traditional euro dollar market. And I just think it's an area, if you're not familiar with, you need to get familiar with as quick as possible. So anyway.
Completely true. Completely true. But just to reiterate, sorry, I'm not trying to get the last word.
No.
All that's true, but you'll often get people say to you, yeah, but the euro dollar system is already a prison. It already works. So why bother here? So just to reiterate again, this one operates outside the banking system. So you basically can drain capital out of those countries completely, out of their banks, into a new network. And at the same time, the Eurodollar system, prison, was built with bricks that previously had made American factories. So effectively, the American factories were dismantled as the Eurodollar prison went up. This system allows bricks to rebuild American factories at the same time. Again, it's too complicated to explain exactly why now.
It's part of the reverse perestroika. It's reverse perestroika, man. That's exactly what it is. So, okay. So Michael, you said you weren't going to try to get the last word, but I am going to give you the last word.
Okay.
Whatever you want to close off here with, I'm just going to say, after you're done talking, I'm just going to say thank you and we'll go on.
Okay. Well, I'm going to be short. I mean, this has been a great chat, a really good way to start the year. We live in really, really interesting times, as the cliche goes. I am currently struggling to keep up on an hourly basis, let alone a daily basis or a weekly basis, because as I mentioned to you earlier, in terms of like, or you did with the fractals, one small split, can really have a larger effect. There are so many fractals appearing everywhere now, and each one of them could potentially flow back in other directions. So don't go mad with it all. Try and just drill down to the basics, the real fundamentals, which we've been talking about here, which is power. And understand that there are enormous opportunities in this, as well as enormous risks. If you understand half of what we've tried to plot out for you here, you are infinitely better placed than, I would say, I don't want to say what percentage, but I think you'd agree with me, a very high percentage of the street, Wall Street, that is, who just can't conceive of the fact that things could change from how they've been done for the past 4.5 decades. So, don't feel you're out of the loop and impotent and powerless about this. Actually, you're ahead of the curve in having these kind of conversations. And you're probably better placed than larger institutions, which are really going to find it hard to pivot rapidly enough to take advantage of them, and will only get the downside rather than the upside. So be encouraged rather than dismayed. Be of good cheer. That's what I would say. But be very, very alert.
Great advice, Michael. Thank you.